September 12, 1942. Deep in the equatorial darkness of the South Atlantic, 600 miles off the coast of West Africa. Below the waves, the air inside U-156 was thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and diesel. Petty Officer Kurt Schahn surveyed the hydrophone readings, the rhythmic thrumming of a large merchant vessel echoing through the hull. Above him, Commander Werner Hartenstein, 27 years old and already a veteran of the Atlantic's deadly chess game, peered through the attack periscope. Bearing Schahn? Hartenstein's voice was low, taut with anticipation. Target is holding steady on 270, her Captain Lieutenant. Estimated speed, 13 knots, Schahn reported. Hartenstein nodded, his gaze locked on the magnified image, a massive, dark silhouette against the faintly moonlit horizon, the British troopship, RMS Laconia. Hartenstein knew her type, a converted liner, a fat target, likely stuffed with soldiers and war material, running alone to evade the convoy routes. For the Grauer Wolf Grey Wolf and his crew, this was the moment they trained for, the culmination of a grueling patrol. The Atlantic was their hunting ground, and Laconia had just stumbled into the jaws of the trap. Bring us to a final attack depth. The range is now 5,000 meters. Prepare tubes 1 and 2. Impact fuse set for 7 meters, Hartenstein ordered, his hand gripping the periscope handles. Every man in the control room moved with practiced surgical precision, the sound of valves hissing and machinery clicking filling the cramped space. They were a machine perfectly tuned for destruction. On board the RMS Laconia, the atmosphere was one of strained, weary security. The ship was crammed far beyond its intended capacity. Outwardly, she was a British troop transport carrying approximately 2,732 people, a chaotic mix of British soldiers, civilian passengers, nurses, merchant seamen, Polish guards, and, critically, 1,800 Italian prisoners of war captured during the North African campaign. Captain Rudolf Sharp had kept the zigzag course religiously, but he was deep in the U-boat hunting zone. Below decks, the Italian POWs, packed into converted cargo holds, knew nothing of the danger. They only knew the suffocating heat and the ceaseless, dizzying roll of the South Atlantic. At 10:07 p.m., Hartenstein made his final check. Zielwasser ready. His eyes narrowed. Fire tube 1. Fire tube 2. 2 G7E electric torpedoes, Dick Fat Ones, as the crew affectionately called them, surged out of the tubes, leaving a barely perceptible trail of bubbles that quickly dissipated. The crew counted the seconds, each man holding his breath. The tension was palpable, a silent prayer echoing in the control room for a clean hit. 1 minute, 22 seconds later, the first massive explosion tore into the starboard side of Laconia, directly into a troop hold. A heartbeat later, the second struck deep beneath the engine room. On deck, the sound was catastrophic. A thunderclap followed by a deafening roar of escaping steam and tearing metal. The light's flicker died, then sputtered back to life, plunging the decks into a macabre, strobe-lit panic. The massive liner immediately listed. Chaos reigned. Lifeboats were lowered, some successfully, others jamming or overturning, spilling survivors into the dark, oily water. The ship was sinking fast. Hartenstein listened, satisfied, to the breaking up sounds. He gave the order to surface for a quick confirmation and to search for any surviving officers for interrogation, standard procedure. U-156 broke the surface with a rush of water, the diesel engines kicking in with a loud, aggressive roar. Hartenstein scanned the wreckage with his binoculars, expecting the usual grim aftermath of a successful sink. But what he saw next, through the smoke and the flotsam, was not what he expected. Shouts in an unfamiliar, melodic language drifted across the water. Then a single horrifying word, repeated again and again, Aiuto, Italiani, Aiuto. The cries of Aiuto, Italiani, sliced through the night air, carrying across the oil-slick swells to the bridge of U-156. Werner Hartenstein lowered his binoculars, the usual predatory satisfaction draining instantly from his face, replaced by a deep furrow of shock. He had torpedoed a ship carrying nearly 2,000 Axis allies. The Italians were nominally fascist comrades, men who were supposed to be fighting alongside the Wehrmacht, not dying in the South Atlantic in a British prison hold. The implications were immediate and severe, violating every convention of naval warfare between supposed allies, albeit by accident. Hartenstein turned to his first watch officer, Lieutenant Dietrich Konenkamp, his voice tight. "They are allies, Konenkamp. Prisoners. This changes everything." The scene unfolding before them was a catastrophe of staggering scale. The RMS Laconia was settling rapidly by the stern, her bow lifting high. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of figures were thrashing in the water. Lifeboats were dangerously overloaded, their occupants pleading for help. The survivors were a terrifying mix. British officers and soldiers, the screaming Italian POWs, and terrified women and children. This was not a military victory. It was a mass drowning of non-combatants and allies. Hartenstein did not hesitate for long. He made a decision that would define his command and ultimately change the laws of war for the Kriegsmarine. Against all standard orders, which strictly forbade risking the U-boat to save enemy survivors, he ordered the immediate start of rescue operations. Bring the boat alongside the wreckage. Send out all available rafts, ropes, and life jackets. Every man who can speak Italian or English, start calling out instructions. We are taking survivors aboard. The crew of U-156, accustomed only to the brutal efficiency of sinking, quickly pivoted to the dangerous, difficult task of rescue. They navigated their submarine, a fragile pressure vessel easily damaged by floating debris and panicked swimmers, into the heart of the wreckage. The deck of U-156 became an improvised hospital and life raft station. Hartenstein himself helped haul exhausted, oil-choked survivors, both Allied and Axis, onto the deck. The immediate priorities were the most vulnerable. Italian POWs, desperate after their ordeal in the holds, climbed over each other to reach the U-boat. But Hartenstein ensured that women and children, regardless of nationality, were given priority. He placed them in the safest parts of the conning tower and control room. By the pre-dawn hours of September 13th, the U-boat's deck was utterly transformed. It was packed with nearly 200 people, including 5 women, children, and dozens of British and Polish survivors, alongside the majority of rescued Italian POWs. The U-boat was dangerously top-heavy, its combat readiness reduced to zero. Hartenstein knew he could not sustain this alone. His U-boat was now a rescue ship, slow-moving, defenseless, and completely vulnerable. He made the unprecedented choice to break radio silence and call for help. At 6 a.m., in clear English, Hartenstein broadcast an appeal over the 25-meter band. "If any ship will assist the shipwrecked crew of the Laconia, I will not attack her, providing I am not attacked by ship or air. I have 195 survivors on board. For 61 degrees south, 26 degrees west, German U-boat." He made arrangements to transfer the Allied survivors into the lifeboats and tow them. To visibly signal his humanitarian intent, he ordered a massive Red Cross flag, painstakingly painted onto a bedsheet by the crew, to be draped over the gun deck and conning tower. He was attempting to transform a wolf into a shepherd, relying entirely on the laws of humanity and the conventions of the sea, even with his enemies. He then reported his location and extraordinary circumstances up the chain of command, requesting immediate assistance from nearby U-boats. The response from Befehlshaber der U-Boot BDU, Admiral Karl Donitz, would soon arrive, but Hartenstein was already committed. He would spend the entire morning holding position, towing 4 overloaded lifeboats, and waiting for help to arrive for the approximately 1,800 people still struggling in the water. The morning of September 13th was an agonizing exercise in risk and compassion for Commander Hartenstein. With the massive Red Cross banner flapping incongruously over his combat vessel, U-156 lay exposed and defenseless, its deck crowded with exhausted, shivering survivors. The sea around them was a grim mosaic of debris, corpses, and the struggling living. Hartenstein maintained his delicate formation, towing the 4 most heavily loaded lifeboats, which contained a total of over 400 people, many of them British. He risked every tactical advantage to abide by a moral code that transcended his nation's orders. His dramatic radio appeal was heard not just by Allied vessels far away, but by the German High Command. The response from Admiral Donitz was cautious, but supportive of Hartenstein's humane action, recognizing the political importance of rescuing Axis POWs, even if it meant breaking tradition. Donitz immediately diverted 3 other U-boats to the scene. U-506 under Captain Lieutenant Erich Werdman, U-507 under Corvettan Captain Haro Schacht, and the Italian submarine Comandante Cappellini under Lieutenant Mario Savino, which was the closest to the location. The wolves were gathering, but not for the kill. They were coming to save. For the survivors in the water, the sight of U-156, a black, terrifying symbol of their destruction, now acting as their sole savior, was surreal. As the hours dragged on under the relentless equatorial sun, the U-boat's presence became a beacon. Hartenstein did everything to stabilize the situation. The German crew distributed what little water and first aid supplies they could spare. A German doctor aboard U-156 tended to both British and Italian injured alike. British officers and German sailors, moments after being mortal enemies, now worked side by side, passing rations and pulling drowning men from the water. By the afternoon, the first reinforcement arrived. The sleek, powerful shape of U-506 surfaced nearby. Captain Lieutenant Werdman immediately took over, towing several additional lifeboats, relieving the pressure on U-156. Soon after, U-507 arrived, commanded by Schacht, who likewise began to take on survivors and coordinate the expanding rescue operation. The 3 German U-boats, normally silent hunters, now clustered together, visible for miles, their decks serving as makeshift pontoons for the injured. The Red Cross flags were now flying from 3 separate U-boats, a clear and conspicuous signal of non-belligerence and a commitment to humanitarian rescue. The immediate problem now was the safe transfer of the survivors to a neutral, larger vessel. Donitz had coordinated with the Vichy French government, securing the deployment of the colonial cruiser Gloire and 2 smaller sloops, the Annamite and the Dumont d'Urville, sailing from Dakar. These ships were steaming toward the position, expected to arrive on September 15th. The U-boat's mission now was simply to hold position, keep the survivors alive, and wait. As the second night fell, the 3 U-boats and the cluster of lifeboats, now numbering over a dozen, formed a desperate, fragile community of thousands of people in the middle of a vast ocean. Hartenstein remained on the bridge of U-156, scanning the skies. He had broadcast his position and intentions openly. He was relying entirely on the Allies, respecting the internationally recognized symbol of the Red Cross and the universal maritime law of aid at sea. He was exposed, but he believed his act of human decency, confirmed by his radio message and the flying flags, would protect them. The waiting was the hardest part. The silence of the night was only punctuated by the groans of the injured and the low thrum of the idling diesel engines, holding position until the French ships arrived. The dawn of September 14th broke clear and hot over the South Atlantic. The rescue cluster was now a floating humanitarian zone. U-156, U-506, and U-507, along with the approaching Italian submarine Comandante Cappellini, held station, collectively supporting several hundred survivors, many clinging directly to the submarine's decks and hulls. The tension among the German crews was immense. They knew that in this exposed position, they were defying the fundamental rule of survival for a U-boat: stealth. Yet, the sight of British and Italian survivors sharing water and blankets, all under the protection of the German naval flag, affirmed Hartenstein's extraordinary moral calculus. But Hartenstein's broadcast had been intercepted, analyzed, and swiftly acted upon by the Allied command, though not in the manner he hoped. The signal reached the American base on Ascension Island, a crucial staging post deep in the Atlantic. The senior officer in charge of the base, Commander Robert C. Richardson, was faced with an impossible choice. His primary mission was the relentless prosecution of the war at sea. German U-boats were the single greatest threat to the Allied war effort. He had received a report of 3 German submarines clustered together, visible and stationary. At 11:30 a.m., high above the clustered scene, the fate of the 1,800 survivors was sealed by an American reconnaissance aircraft. A U.S. Army Air Force's B-24 Liberator bomber, piloted by Lieutenant James D. Harden, appeared from the north. Harden's crew spotted the unusual sight: 3 large submarines surrounded by lifeboats, one clearly draped with a red and white banner. The U-150 SIXS massive improvised Red Cross flag was fully visible. Harden circled the scene, reporting his findings back to Ascension Island. His message detailed the presence of lifeboats and the flags, but crucially, he also noted that the submarines were German. Commander Richardson, reviewing the report back on Ascension, wrestled with the rules of engagement. While the Red Cross flag theoretically afforded protection, the presence of 3 active service enemy U-boats in a hunting pack formation, regardless of their current activity, was deemed an unacceptable threat. He believed that this might be an elaborate trap, a ruse to lure in Allied surface vessels for an easy kill, or simply a violation of the neutral status by the presence of armed warships. Richardson's infamous order was blunt, driven by the ruthlessness of total war: sink subs. Lieutenant Harden received the command, and despite the visual evidence of humanitarian activity below, the clear flags, the lifeboats clustered around the submarines, and the figures waving for rescue, he prepared for an attack run. War rules, interpreted by a desperate commander thousands of miles away, had trumped the law of the sea. At 12:32 p.m., the B-24 dove out of the sun. The first attack run was aimed directly at the most stationary target, U-156. Hartenstein, on the bridge, saw the Liberator banking and descending. The moment of terrible realization hit him. His act of mercy was being met with lethal force. He shouted a frantic order for the few able-bodied survivors on deck to scramble below, and the klaxon sounded the immediate crash dive. But there was no time. The Liberator released its payload. The roar of the B-24 Liberator's engines intensified into a shrieking descent, a sound of mechanized terror that shattered the fragile peace of the rescue operation. Hartenstein screamed for the German crew to get below, but dozens of survivors, British soldiers, Italian POWs, and Polish guards, were caught completely exposed on the main deck of U-156. The bombs struck immediately after the U-boat began its frantic crash dive. The first 2 500-pound bombs missed, sending up massive geysers that drenched the deck. But the third bomb was a devastating near-miss. It detonated just yards off the starboard bow, the shock wave violently rocking the U-boat. The Red Cross flag was shredded into ribbons. The explosion ripped through the air, killing several survivors instantly, mangling others, and throwing dozens more, injured and panicked, back into the open sea. Crucially, the blast severely damaged U-150 SAXS radio antenna, temporarily crippling their communication and compromising the forward ballast tanks. The U-boat was badly shaken but operational, managing to level off far below the surface. Lieutenant Harden, despite the clear evidence of the Red Cross and the overwhelming number of non-combatants, pressed the attack. He turned the B-24 and targeted the next most prominent stationary vessel, U-506. Wordman, seeing the attack on U-156, had managed to cast off the lifeboats he was towing and initiate a dive, but the Liberator was too quick. Harden dropped a second stick of bombs, one of which impacted near the stern of U-506, narrowly missing the conning tower, but severely injuring several Italian survivors still clinging to the deck railings. The subsequent panic was absolute. The coordinated rescue operation instantly dissolved into a massacre. The force of the bombings created deadly turbulence, overturning the very lifeboats the U-boats had been towing. Survivors who had been clinging to the submarines' hulls now realized that the German vessels, their brief saviors, were fleeing. They were suddenly faced with the impossible horror of being attacked by their own side, the rescuers becoming targets, and the rescued being killed by friendly fire. Hartenstein was forced to keep U-156 submerged for over an hour, listening to the agonizing noises of his former passengers drowning above him. When Hartenstein finally resurfaced, the scene was one of renewed carnage. The water was strewn with fresh bodies and shattered wreckage. The French ships were still far off. His U-boat was damaged, his position compromised, and his humanitarian efforts brutally punished. Hartenstein immediately signaled the other U-boats and, with profound bitterness, broadcast a message back to Admiral Donitz detailing the Allied bombing of his clearly marked rescue operation. The repercussions were instantaneous and devastating. Admiral Karl Donitz, infuriated by the blatant violation of the laws of war and the risk taken by his captains, issued a chilling and absolute directive known thereafter as the Laconia Order, officially Triton Null. It stated unequivocally that no attempt was to be made by any U-boat to rescue survivors from torpedoed ships. Survivors were to be regarded as enemies, and the risk to the U-boat was paramount. Furthermore, the order strictly prohibited furnishing survivors with food or water, and it explicitly forbade offering aid of any kind. The Laconia incident, driven by Hartenstein's unprecedented act of mercy, had paradoxically ensured that mercy would be forever withheld in the Battle of the Atlantic. The handful of U-boats were forced to abandon the remaining survivors to the mercies of the ocean. Though the French cruiser Gloire eventually arrived to pick up the few hundred survivors still clinging to the floating debris 2 days later, an estimated 1,500 people died in the water, many of them killed directly or indirectly by the American attack on the German rescue effort. Hartenstein, the German U-boat commander, had tried to save them all, only for the hand of war to violently betray the symbol of the Red Cross.